Welcome everybody to another edition in the journalism speaker series here at Diablo Valley College. We are delighted today to have two wonderful guests, professors, authors, join us about a really fantastic and timely book, which we're going to get to momentarily. But just very quickly, want to remind everybody, I'm Mickey Huff. I'm the chair of the journalism department. Here at Diablo Valley College, I teach in history, social science, and journalism. And just a quick announcement, our journalism program has numerous courses for majors and non-majors. And like we like to say in many of the public talks that we do, democracy needs journalists. And we need to educate people about journalism and the role of media in society. So again, our classes aren't just for people that want to major in journalism, they're for people to help understand media in general. And we certainly could use some elevated discourse and understanding around our media ecosystem. So if you want to learn more about our journalism program, you can contact me, mhuff@dvc.edu, or you can contact our faculty member and journalism inquirer advisor, the advisor to the student newspaper, Michael Levitin. I'll put that contact information over in the chat for interested parties. So that said, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our topic today, and I'd like to introduce our esteemed guests. Our guests today are Dr. Nicholas Baham III. He is professor of ethnic studies at California State University, East Bay, where he teaches courses in Black studies and genders and sexualities in communities of color. His research, publications, teaching, and professional conference presentations focus on alternative Black cultural, spiritual, and sexual experiences, jazz studies, James Baldwin, comparative ethnic studies, and Afrofuturism. I've known Dr. Baham for a number of years. He works with us at the Media Freedom Foundation on our board, and it's a delight and honor to have known him and worked with him for a number of years, and it's great to have him here today with his co-author to talk about their new book. So let me introduce our next speaker as well, then I'll get to the book, and then I'm going to hand it over to you two gentlemen. Our other guest today is Dr. Nolan Higdon, author and university lecturer of history and media studies at California State University, East Bay. His research focuses on digital culture, news media history, and critical media literacy. He's a founding member of the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas, and I'm proud to also call him a co-author myself. Nolan and I have two books together. One is United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation and Post-Truth America, and What We Can Do About It, out on City Lights from 2019. And we actually have a new book out just this past month. So Nolan's had two books out in the last month. That book is called Let's Agree to Disagree, A Critical Thinking Guide to Communication, Conflict Management, and Critical Media Literacy. We'll be doing an event next month talking about that book. But today, we are here to talk about again, a really timely and fascinating book. This book is called The Podcaster's Dilemma, Decolonizing Podcasters in the Era of Surveillance Capitalism. And very briefly, just want to give a little bit of an overview, and then I'm going to hand it over to our experts today. This is a fascinating exploration of modern podcasting as a tool for decolonization, and that's all going to come up in our talk today. The authors connect contemporary podcasting to the broader history of the use of radio technology in the service of anti-colonial struggle and revolution. And by organizing the book's analysis of decolonization through podcasting via three distinct activities: interrogation and critique, counter-narrative, and call to action, both Nick and Nolan, the authors create a lens through which they analyze and evaluate the decolonizing potential of new podcasts. Their book also goes into other details. It looks actually at a number of popular and other podcasts, maybe that are maybe lesser known. But again, I'm going to sort of hand things over to them and let them tell you more about not just what's in the book, but we're going to have kind of a conversation, certainly have some dialogue. And again, given that this is such a timely issue, podcasting is a wildly popular medium. And I think we lack in many ways a lot of critical media literacy conversations around that space. But today we're going to really fill that hole with our guests. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Nicholas Baham III and Dr. Nolan Higdon. We're all clapping for you. Thanks again for making time out of your schedules, gentlemen. Let's start this. Just give us a brief outline. And Nolan, I guess we'll start with you. How did you come to writing this book in particular? Tell us a little bit about this, and then we'll let you all converse.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mickey, and thank you everybody at DVC for hosting us. It's always great to be around all you folks, get to chat with you. And of course, it's always great to be with Dr. Baham. Nick and I have done a lot of work together. We've done some radio work together, podcasting work together, and we had written together. And in the process of doing our podcast, Nick and I wanted to really, explore the space to kind of make our podcast more popular and reach more audiences. So we were, looking at what are other podcasters doing. And Nick came to me one morning and said, a lot of these podcasters seem to be using this space, as a space of decolonization. Has anybody written about this? And I said, not that I know of, but I'll check it out. And so I sort of went down the rabbit hole of looking at everything that had been written about with the podcasting space. And I said, man, most of the stuff in the podcasting space is really talking about like how you can use it in the classroom, which is important, or, like a how-to guide of how to make podcasts, but no one's actually looked at podcasters. And so, Nick's question and that little research ended up being the genesis for what became the podcaster's dilemma. And, Nick had this great idea of taking what we're seeing in the podcasting space and applying it to revolutionary radio, which I'll let Nick talk about, because I think it's kind of his an exciting take on how he sort of came up with this idea and ultimately how we ended up applying it.
Yeah, thank you, Nolan. First of all, also, I want to give thanks to the DVC community for hosting us here, and also acknowledge that this work really, in many respects, is a work of love that came out of, what do we do, Nolan? We did like well over 200 episodes of our Along the Line podcast. And a part of our process always in doing our podcasting was kind of constantly critiquing ourselves for what we were doing. And then also, again, realizing that there isn't anything out there that makes any kind of a critical assessment of this work. And that often happens with new media, particularly we've seen this happen around social media. You have the beast unleashed before we've actually made any actual critical assessment of the impact of these kinds of things in our society. And I think we can see, particularly from social media platforms like Facebook, that our inability to sort of catch up critically on these kinds of things has not been good. So we wanted to definitely provide that lens. I would consider a lot of what we've done here to be an outgrowth of a particular chapter in Frantz Fanon's book, A Dying Colonialism, in which he deals with the critical importance of revolutionary radio, pirate radio in Algeria, and by extension, I would say in every other revolutionary struggle in the post-World War II era, which would include places like Angola, folks in Central America. And the deeper that we looked into it, we saw that the things that Fanon was suggesting about the voice of fighting in Algeria in terms of the reappropriation of the very popular radio format for revolutionary purposes, even the ability of the radio to lessen the negative colonial connotations of the French language, were, we suspected, also happening within the podcasting format. And as it turns out, we also found that podcasting is profoundly linked to radio, that in fact, a number of the initial first podcasts themselves were digital files of radio broadcasts. And then we see things like in 2013 in the protests in Turkey, people using these mixed media platforms in order to get forward their revolutionary message. A little bit of radio, a little bit of social media, a little bit of podcasting in order to get that done. So this was something we suspected, and then we found that this was there's a real sense of depth to this, that there really is an evolution of a certain voice in podcasting that comes out of similar voices in revolutionary radio, as detailed by Fanon and others. But we should also talk with you a little bit about who our podcasters are. And I want to turn that back to Nolan to just talk a little bit about the kinds of people who are behind the mic.
Totally, I can do that. So, like I said, Nick had originally sort of brought up this question about how they were using it as a space of, podcasters were using the space as a space of decolonization. And so, we kind of did a deep dive of looking up about the writings about colonization, right? About how the decolonial process necessitates that folks look at these relics from the colonial period. And the context we were interested, we were looking at the colonial relics or the colonial mentalities from patriarchy and white supremacy and heteronormativity, ableist mentalities and things like this. So how are the podcasting space responding to these, the colonial influence of these ideologies? And so we collected these, a litany of different podcasts, and Nick and I just sort of went to work. We pulled a sample of podcasters who were dealing with these issues, and we just started listening, tuning in and seeing what folks were talking about, how they were approaching these subjects, what they were saying. And one of the first things we wanted to kind of assess was, who are these people? Who are these podcasters? And we found that just like they focus on a diverse and broad range of topics, they come from a diverse and broad range of backgrounds. Some of these folks are entrepreneurs. Some of these folks come from the nonprofit world. Some of these folks actually come from the entertainment industry. We were looking for commonalities. We found that a substantial amount of them had a background in writing or journalism. So these were folks who are already accomplished writers and journalists. So I think it sort of speaks to that idea, to write well is to think well, and the podcast is a space where folks are thinking. A lot of them had a history of working in traditional journalism or journalistic outlets. So they had actually gone from the traditional space into the podcasting space. And we think that speaks to a larger trend, which we'll talk about later, where a lot of folks are moving to the podcasting space away from some of the legacy media, and we'll talk about why that is. We did see a lot of homogeneity, though, in terms of educational background. So we saw, these are folks who had credentials, that range. Some had advanced degrees and were teaching at universities. Other folks had bachelor degrees, some folks had JDs, and things like that. So I think when it comes to the homogeneity of the podcasters we saw, they tended to have a background in writing and journalism and tended to come from an formally educated background. But beyond that, they were really diverse, really, in every sense of the word as we looked at these folks. So it was one thing to assess kind of, who these people were and what the subjects were that they were covering. But we want to look at what does the decolonial process look like in podcasting, right? So we know the theoretical concepts of decolonization. We know the dominant ideologies that they're addressing, but what does it actually look like in terms of nuts and bolts in the podcasting space? And so that's kind of where the book turns after we get to know the podcasters. And I'll let Nick describe this sort of process we investigated of what decolonization in the podcasting space looks like.
Yes, thank you, Nolan. So sort of drawing from Fanon, we identified 3 stages. First, initially, interrogation and critique, which involves challenging the very principles of colonial domination to the degree that in the course of challenging those, as Fanon says, you can mutate the consciousness of the colonized. The second phase is the counter-narrative production. So once the critique has happened and the consciousness has been mutated, are there other stories or other narratives that need to be pushed to the center as the narratives of the colonizer? In other words, in this case, American dominant culture are pushed to the margins. And then finally, a call to action. So once we've done kind of the discursive labor that needs to be done, how does this actually translate to social movements on the streets? Organizing. Is podcasting being used in that way? And just to give you a few examples of this, in interrogation and critique, we saw things like there's a podcast called Code Switch that interrogated this issue of what is a Karen. We thought that was quite interesting. There's a podcast called Our National Conversations, a conversation about conversations about race, a very long title. But they really got into this issue of what is the responsibility for European Americans in dismantling racial ideas. Scene on Radio we found had a 14-part primer on the historical underpinnings of white supremacy. Again, just sort of asking, where did these things come from? This was a great space for us too, because so much of what Nolan and I were doing in the Along the Line podcast was interrogation and critique, asking questions that had not been previously asked about subjects that were just kind of out there in the popular media. And Nolan, before I move on to examples of counter-narrative production, did you have any other things that you wanted to add about some of the podcasts we looked at under interrogation and critique?
Yeah, I think it's worth noting also, you had these podcasters were even interrogating like their allies in a constructive way, right? So, they would talk about sort of like the intersectionality of feminism and kind of what that meant, right? I'm thinking of programs like The Guilty Feminist. We heard some of that. So I think there was some value there in that. We also saw quite a lot of podcasts about that use like food as a method for interrogation. So I'm thinking of like Latinos Who Lunch was a podcast we really enjoyed, where they used food as a starting point to investigate colonial mentalities. And then we also found a substantial amount of podcasts about sexuality. So exploring sexuality, exploring relationships. These were ranged from like multiple partners to how we negotiate sexual relations with others. There were podcasts that were hosted by swingers. One married couple in particular, I think it was the Mr. and Mrs. Jones podcast, where they talked about like what it was like to be a swinger and how they navigated this space and what it was like being a swinger during the COVID-19 pandemic, the complications that brought. So the interrogation and critique was very focused on these podcasts. They all sort of had a niche that we were able to go in and investigate.
There's a lot of that too, particularly around heteronormativity and patriarchy and issues related to women of color feminisms that came into the counter-narrative production too. So they're critiquing heteronormativity, and then they're also presenting aspects of their own lives. So we looked at a broad range of things within these three structures of these three phases of decolonization, everything from neoliberalism to ableism and white supremacy and heteronormativity in each of these areas. What Nolan is referring to here, particularly around heteronormativity, there was an incredible richness in the counter-narrative section. Royal Fetish Radio, Latina Hot Wife Adventures, and an amazing amount of people of color voices in that space. We even found an indigenous polyamorous podcast called The Critical Polyamorist. These are kind of important because one of the things that we're always constantly trying to do within critical media studies is, there are things that are being broadcast to us every single day. So for example, if I go on Netflix, I will find programs that provide some sort of a critique of heteronormativity. The issue is really beyond the sort of the things that corporate media produces. How are people on the street, and in particular in this case, many people of color, marginalized people, appropriating this stuff, and what are their kinds of recommendations in light of what dominant culture is communicating about non-monogamy, other ways of dismantling patriarchy, etc. And you find that there is a critical dissonance there. For me, on the one level, when I look at what dominant culture is doing, it comes across often as advertising. And at the very least, it's very light on substance. But when I listen to some of these podcasts, I'm listening to people on the ground who are really doing these things and are able to provide concrete advice and concrete warnings about engaging in certain behaviors, even if you find them to be on sort of intellectually stimulating. You have to have this understanding of how does it really play out, and what's the real political importance of this kind of stuff that they're engaging in within their own communities. How are they building communities out of this? Do communities exist for people of color and marginalized people? And are there intersectional overlaps where maybe I'm doing something that's interesting in a sexuality space, but are there intersectional overlaps around class and race that make that space restrictive in some cases? So yeah, a ton of stuff like that in the counter narrative production. And then finally with call to action, we looked at things like Alicia Garza's Lady Don't Take No, where you have the voice of one of the founders of Black Lives Matter talking about activism, all the way to things like, we found this wonderful podcast called Rebel Steps, where they give you instructions on how to deal with being arrested or washing pepper spray, flushing it out of your eyes. And a number of these things, including DeRay McKesson's podcast, Pod Save the People, you will get more direct interviews from people who are activists from the street, broadcasts during protests. These are most closely aligned with what Fanon was talking about with the voice of Fighting Algeria, where you're getting essentially reports from the front. And as we know, the way that popular legacy news media is often framed, those aren't the experts that get interviewed when a report is given about any particular protest.
Yeah, I think that's a great place. That, and coupled with how you sort of talked about the surface level analysis that we get from legacy media is a great way to kind of talk about how we got into this idea of the dilemma that faced podcasters. So I think it's worth noting, and it should be obvious from what we've said so far, that Nick and I are big champions of this space. Like, we really like podcasters, we like these podcasts, and this book is written largely to celebrate what's being done in this space. But we're also critical scholars, and so we did have some critiques that we offer largely for constructive purposes in the text. And so, one of the things I think to set up these critiques that's worth noting is that the podcasters, they operate in a space that they largely don't own. So Nick talked about this building of community, which is really critical to podcasters, where like so much of legacy media, they try and compete against each other for audiences. In the podcasting space, podcasters typically invite other podcasters on their show as a way to promote other podcasts. It's this cultural, this podcast culture welcomes the idea of promoting each other.
And Nolan, what's interesting is that's consistent with revolutionary radio, where different revolutionary groups would share their access to radio technology across borders.
Absolutely, yeah. Great point. And the ways in which, though, this community is being built, and this is one of our concerns, this is the podcaster's dilemma, is it's being built using tools in a space that's largely owned and controlled by a handful of corporations. And these corporations' goal is to, collect and weaponize data wherever they can. These corporations have the ability to censor content they find problematic or threatening, amplify content that they like. And so while there is great things being done in this space, and we see the great potential for the space, we also see surveillance capitalism as a threat to the space. So this new economic order, which tries to collect and analyze data on individuals, because historically, such surveillance has been used to marginalize and further exploit the most vulnerable communities, which the podcasters we looked at tend to come from in this space. Furthermore, we don't think it's sort of shocking that the legacy media has got on board with kind of chiding what's going on in the podcasting space. They say it's, hateful speech or falsehoods. All these kinds of claims are made against the podcasting space, not necessarily because they're true, but largely because the podcasting space is a threat to legacy media. So the commercialization is another threat that we talk about, another dilemma. What we mean by that is the popularity of podcasts stand in direct contradiction to what legacy media has told us for decades. Legacy media has told us that audiences have no attention span. You have to talk in short segments. Now people are tuning into like 3-hour podcasts. Or, people don't care about these niche issues. Well, these podcasts are dedicating hours a day to niche issues and drawing huge audiences. All these sort of things we've been told about audiences prove false once you get to the podcasting space. And this isn't just sort of anecdotal. We have numbers on this. Legacy media audiences are dwindling and new media audiences are increasing. And as Nick pointed out, when it came to issues of, say, racism or sexism or homophobia, legacy media's response was sort of like vapid attempts at representation, right? We'll check the boxes, we'll put in tokens so we can say we're not racist. In the podcasting space, it's not only that you see that representation or more representation, it's also that translates into actual conversations, counter storytelling, different topics. So it's not just representation for representation's sake. It's actually a transformation of what we're talking about, what we're looking at, what's important. And that's why the podcasting space is such a threat. So one of the things we talk about in the end of the text is not only this threat, but how those of us who care about, truth and the ability to access information in general, but the podcasting space in particular, should really think about how we can shape this space to be one that's conducive to keep welcoming podcasters. Because right now we see these folks from the establishment, whether it be like Hillary Clinton's or Barack Obama's, people from establishment media like Rachel Maddow, they're getting podcasts and they're drawing away some of those audiences. And we saw with like Joe Rogan going to Spotify that some of these platforms that host podcasters, they're willing to pay certain podcasters like Joe Rogan a lot of money. Does that mean that they will promote Joe Rogan over these podcasters who are operating in the decolonial space? These are the kind of things we need to think about ahead of time and get involved in. So in that way, it's a warning. But I'll let Nick talk about some of the specific solutions that we offer at the end of the text for how to address the podcaster's dilemma.
Well, specifically, one of the things that we looked at was we looked at some of the Canadian laws that protect privacy. In particular, Canada's Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA, which passed in 2000. And what we were interested in here as a recommendation is the way that particular act allows an individual consumer to make their own decisions about what aspects of their data can be shared. And therefore, their data can't be shared without their permission, their express permission. We have no such regulations within this country. Additionally, there's the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. But we also spoke, and this is stuff that could probably come up in conversation in this session, we also spoke to the issue of needing to break up some of the larger tech firms that control these spaces. I think it's fair to say that for those of us who have looked at this in the media space, that certainly in the media space and definitely outside of it, this country is in desperate need of a new trust busting era, particularly when it comes to information, because information is so central to building a democracy. And given the fact that we now have large companies who are selling us kind of boutique designer bits of news so that we all get the truth, or the truths with a small t, that we feel most comfortable with, and avoid, therefore, facts that we're uncomfortable with. How do we reach consensus in this country around even the basic things that we should be debating about? It's madness. I mean, just even watching these Supreme Court nomination hearings and realizing that there are people who are speaking to a world of facts that only exist on a darknet space for QAnon supporters it's absolutely absurd. Where do we need to get to in terms of regulating basic facts that we can all agree upon, and then form our debates? And I think part of the problem that Nolan and I recognized here, and I'm sure a number of you do too, is just the control that these giant corporations have. Even the notion of Facebook as a sort of a clearinghouse of news and information, which is absurd.
Yeah, I can concur. I think you said it well there, Nick, and I hope folks enjoy the text. I think in addition to kind of the case we make in the text, I think one of the most useful parts of the text, if you are a podcaster, I think it's useful to kind of think about these things and how you situate yourself in the podcasting space. But if you're a podcast user, someone who wants to listen to these podcasts, the book really is a helpful guide into all the different podcasts that are out there, and possibly can guide you toward podcasts that are in areas you're interested in, or areas you don't even know you're interested in yet. So I appreciate the opportunity to present on this with Dr. Baham, and really thank Mickey Huff and the DVC community for hosting us, and look forward to some Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Dr. Nolan Higdon, Dr. Nicholas Baham III. The book we're discussing, just out from Wiley Blackwell, is The Podcaster's Dilemma, Decolonizing Podcasters and the End of Surveillance Capitalism. This is another installment of the Journalism Speaker Series, Spring 22, here at Diablo Valley College. Dr. Baham teaches ethnic studies at Cal State East Bay. Nolan Higdon teaches at East Bay, also in the UC, and Nolan also teaches with us at DVC, of course, in the history department and social sciences, and does a lot of work with us in journalism. And I have the good pleasure of working with both of these gentlemen at Project Censored over the years, where we address and tackle a lot of the challenges that were just presented from both Doctors Baham and Higdon. So let's get into some conversation about that, right? And I think the stuff that you talk about at the end, both Nick and Nolan, about the role of corporate media and ownership and the way different societies regulate these matters, that's a real conversation we should all be having, right? Another thing that comes out of your book and your conversation is our inability as a society to have a conversation. And these podcasts that you all analyze are conversation starters in a lot of ways. And they don't just start the conversations that we agree with, they start the conversations maybe that we just need to really have. So I want to thank both of you for spending some time with us this afternoon. And I want to open things up. As ever, anybody here have any questions or comments for our guests today? Anybody, anything you want to bring up? It doesn't even have to be a question. It could be a comment, a remark. Let's kind of model keeping a conversation going on here. Anybody have anything to say? You can feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. Folks?
Hi, thank you for for talking to us today. I'm Obed. I haven't read the book, but I have it, so that'll be on my list, for spring break. So, but one of the things, I don't know, I haven't looked at it, but one of the things that came to my mind as podcasters is what kind of access do they have, and do you address that in your book in terms of the degree, right? Because access is important in order to get the message out. Especially, I really like the idea that they're the voice of the street activists, right, type of thing. And so they need access, and what kind of ways is access opened?
Nick and Nolan?
Nolan, did you want to get into that? Do you want me to start that?
You good?
So there are, first of all, it's important to understand that I think one of the most powerful things about podcasting is that it's a far cheaper, there are far fewer barriers to entry than its previous form of radio, much easier to get into. And there are a number of different platforms that our podcasters wind up using. Nolan, I can't remember the exact number of different platforms, from Podbean to even going on Spotify, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a reasonable choice of platforms for our podcasters to use. The question is, for me, is always around visibility. And I think Nolan raised this issue with respect to Joe Rogan's podcast and the investment that Spotify has put into that, and problems with, like, if your podcast is also on Spotify, are you getting the same kind of publicity that Rogan is getting around his podcast? And that, by the way, is consistent with the other platforms that our podcasters use too, because many of them are plugged into a variety of other social media platforms. Some of which, by the way, they also use for fundraising. And then, refer to that fundraising within the podcast themselves, and their friends who are podcasters with other programs also draw attention to their fundraising efforts. I think there's still very much struggle for people who aren't named Joe Rogan or aren't, bigger names to push forward. And I think one of the things we were hoping to do in this book is to direct people towards deeper searches for these podcasters. I would say that on the whole, what we are talking about here is a genre of podcasting that, even though there is access to getting it done, because of publicity, these are still really marginal voices with smaller communities. There are a lot of them because there's over 1 million podcasts out there, but we're still talking about, if you want to use an analogy to television, we're still talking about people who are running, we're old enough to remember those late night programs, community stuff that's on, like, channel 26 at 2 a.m. We're still talking about that kind of a thing to some degree.
Yeah. If I could add to that, I think it's a great question. Nick's answered most of it, but I think it's got a complicated answer because, on the one hand, it's really easy to record in comparison to, like, radio. If you have access to some digital tools, recording devices, internet, which, there are plenty of folks who do not, but assuming you do, then it's easy. But then the question becomes the next part, which is, like, which platforms do you put it on? So do you just put it on Apple, or do you also put it on Podbean? Do you put it on Stitcher? Do you add it to all those different places? And then, I would argue it's best to put it on as many as possible because some of these platforms remove content, as we've seen recently, especially like Abby Martin's show getting taken down. So you can lose visibility. But then, like, on social media, you also need to plug the show on all your social media platforms because some social media algorithms will censor some of your content as well. So in some ways, access to actually recording the podcast may actually be easier than getting the podcast out there in terms of getting folks to actually listen to it or know it exists.
And I would say too that one of the things that we need to add to this discussion, and frankly we don't have enough of in the book, are movements that are being made within communities to produce free access in communities that want to hear and need to hear this kind of material. I'm thinking, I'm here in Oakland, and I'm thinking about some of the podcasts that we listen to that come out of, there's one that we listen to that is self-described as broadcast out of deep East Oakland, right? And for anybody who's an Oaklander, you know that East Oaklanders certainly have a sense of, like, this is a city unto itself. East Oakland is a place unto itself, even outside of Oakland, generally speaking. Is Wi-Fi available freely to the kinds of listeners and communities that these podcasters are bringing together? Because every one of these podcasters that we're talking about are creating and are built upon and supported by their own individual communities. And that includes, by the way, people who have been willing to donate money or provide money for those podcasts to continue. The one that I referenced in Deep East Oakland, I've forgotten the title of it, but they explicitly draw on community resources within East Oakland. And there are a number of them that we covered that are like that, where, you know, individual businesses in those areas, particularly in our sexuality space. So like if there's a Black-owned, sex place where sex toys are available, they will broadcast, or hair care products or whatever. You will see that in the same way that you saw that back in the day before we had fully corporate owned radio. I think some of us are old enough to remember things like a KDIA or even KPOO, which still exists, that was more community centered and supported by local businesses, generally people of color businesses in those neighborhoods. So access to, for audiences to free online, to free Wi-Fi is also critical here too.
Anybody else have questions, comments for our guests? I certainly have a few things I can throw out there. Thank you to our Dean, Obed Vazquez, for kicking off our Q&A session. There's still some people here. Anybody want to chime in? Anybody have questions or comments about podcasting, any of the material that you're hearing so far? I'd like to at least remind folks that are here that, for example, you talk about access. The community college is an access point, and our program in general, in journalism, we have podcasting equipment in the journalism lab. We have a Journalism 130 multimedia class that focuses on social media, podcasting, really giving students the opportunity to be the content creators, right? And I know, Nolan, you just said a little bit ago that while there are people that don't have access to some of this technology, this is a place where we can offer access to that technology for folks. And you don't have to be a journalism major to get access to these things. So if you want students to get involved, I see Dr. Ponce chiming in. Students can get access to it by contacting me or contacting Professor Michael Levitin. They can do it by signing up for a course, Journalism 130, with Rosa Leither, who teaches that course, and kind of get people off the ground in it. So I think that that's really important, but I keep coming back to the other part of that equation, that while we encourage people to be the media and get involved in their own storytelling, Nick, you really kind of doubled down on the ownership problem and who's controlling the space. And on one level, thinking community radio, I have that other hat at the project, right? Project Censored. I have more of a traditional public affairs program on public media, community media at KPFA, that airs on stations across the country, syndicated, old school, right? But it's difficult even to break into that space. Like you said, there were more community media and there were more accessible community media perhaps elsewhere. And podcasting is enticing because it does open the door for a lot of people to get involved. But then we get back to the distribution, the platforming, and these handful of big tech companies that kind of control how you're found, right? How your message gets found. So Nick and Nolan, do you have anything to maybe add about the getting found part of this, right? And I think education has a big role in this. And I think that that's what your book really does, is it doesn't just provide expert analysis about what's happening in this space, sort of the redux of the way radio gets taken over, television, et cetera. But it really prescribes a lot of ways to prevent that from happening and encourages people to get involved in those spaces. But just curious to hear maybe some feedback or maybe some of your ideas about those challenges.
Yeah, I can jump in and say a couple of things. I'm sure Nick has plenty to say as well. When it comes to this idea of being found, I'm not necessarily, I would say you don't need to shoot for like a Walter Cronkite size audience when you create a podcast. Those days are sort of dead. You need to create, a podcast that reaches a fair amount of folks, but not necessarily a super large audience like half the country. As far as the question about education, I do think education plays a critical role here, whether we like it or not. You know, a lot of us here are people who write books. A lot of folks are getting information. I think it's a good thing through the podcasting space. So why not set students up to not only listen to podcasts, but participate in the construction of them? I do this in my classes. There's a lot of assignments where you can have students make podcasts to show that they're familiar with the learning content and that they're able to apply their analysis to it and give their perspective on it. So I think there's a lot of work we could do in the education space to use the existing podcast to help inform students or give students perspectives that they can analyze. But we can also use the tools of the classroom to make students better podcasters themselves.
I would say too, Mickey, that in terms of being found, I want to recognize that, at least in my opinion, the best journalist in 2020 was the young woman who stood there with her hand steady while she filmed the murder of George Floyd from start to finish, from him being pulled out of his vehicle to, calling for his mother during his final breaths. And so how does somebody like that, I think, an interesting question is, how does somebody like that get found? And yes, Mickey, as you put in the chat, citizen journalism matters. And really when in our book, when we're in this space of call to action, really all three of the spaces, but in particular in call to action, we are talking about citizen activists, right? Who are getting their voices out there to a broader public. So the question is, how does somebody get found? And I think that this is the thing in the book. I think it's both clearly stated by us and also implied throughout. These things don't happen without compatible movements, social movements happening at the same time. So how does she get her video out? She gets her video out because there's an ongoing national social movement called Black Lives Matter. That's how she gets her stuff out. And that puts heat on the rest of the media, whether that be, folks who control, companies who control social media or legacy media, to start paying attention to those things either. Unfortunately, it doesn't do, social media and frankly, legacy media still doesn't do a good enough job of going back to the communities and having discussions with the individuals who were part of the movements that stimulated getting this stuff out there. But podcasting does, the podcasters we've looked at do fill in that void. Certainly my listening of Garza's podcast, just to name one, shows how she can fill in that void and has done so very effectively. But I think that one of the things for us to understand here is that this is a both and proposition, just as it was for Fanon. It's not the radio alone, it's the radio and the revolution, right? So in this case, it is definitely the podcast and the social movement. And I think if we took one of those away, the other one would certainly be less effective. And potentially, if you take the revolution away and just have the podcasting, in my opinion, becomes irrelevant if things aren't really happening and if there isn't a real back and forth conversation between whoever's behind the mic and who's on the street.
Anybody else? We've got a few minutes left. Now's your chance. Both our guests today, reminder, also hosted a podcast all along the line. So had a lot of experience putting that on, addressed a lot of key issues and subjects, the kind of things that you heard Dr. Baham saying right now. You modeled a lot of that in your own program, right? These kind of community conversations around activism and these issues. Anybody else want to chime in here?
Just a last comment. One, it was pretty timely because just this last week, the New York Times, the mega company, they're doing a study on podcast and looking at and trying to look at their subscribers in terms of the use of podcasts. And as a sociologist, I see that as sort of a process of co-option, right? It's like, monopolizing the whole system. But it's important. They have their eye on it. So they've caught, right, the fact that this is important. It's an important part of how information is being disseminated.
And I would say about that too, that this is also a process that happened with revolutionary radio. So as soon as, for example, in the case of the Voice of Fighting Algeria, as soon as the Algerians got a hold of pirate radio, there was an attempt by the French to reappropriate that, and in some cases to produce radio broadcasts that were sort of fake Voice of Fighting Algeria to provide false news. There's going to be a constant back and forth. But what I'm excited about are people who are on the streets, who are activists, who are willing to engage in this back and forth with legacy media. And I do think that the recommendations that we've made within the text could be significant in winning the battle for the voices of people who are in the streets, who are doing what they're doing, who are in the active process of decolonizing, over and against those legacy media voices. If we had something like PIPEDA, I think it would make it so much easier for people to engage in this kind of media.
Yeah, no, I agree. And to Obed's point, Tim Wu writes about this. There's like this historical cycle. When a new medium comes out, everyone gets really excited and sees the revolutionary potential. They jump in. This is going to solve all our problems. The giant audience draws the attention of corporations who take it, they homogenize it, they sanitize it, they pasteurize it, and then audiences hate it and they move on to like the next medium. And so I think, what we're speaking to in the book, right, is like, let's resist that urge. To your point about the New York Times, and we've seen this from the New York Times, we've seen this from MSNBC. They've tried to break this trend toward new media down to, well, people just like podcasts better than legacy media, so let's just make a legacy media podcast. But that's what our book shows. That's not it at all. It's the content of these podcasts, like the ways in which they're going about these issues and the issues they're looking at are drawing audiences. You can't take Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow and put them on a podcast and draw that same audience, unless they're going to be talking about swinging and interrogating white supremacy.
And I know I don't want to hear Sean Hannity talking about swinging. I can assure you of that. But I would say too, Nolan, one of the beautiful things about this process that we went through, Nolan, I remember when you said, it's in the text too, who would listen, to some badly produced audio, right? With someone just rambling on for hours. And, the other part about that, Nolan, is that there's a voice of authenticity there, right? So it's, so many of these podcasts that I've listened to, there's noise in the background, somebody's dog is barking, or, some other kind of distraction. Someone feels like they need to take a break in the middle to be able to take care of their child. There's a couple of them where people are clearly smoking pot while they're actually, in recording the broadcast. Legacy media will never go there. And for that reason, I think to the ear of the listener, and again, I would take us back once again to the Voice of Fighting Algeria, to the ear of the listener, I think people are listening to the authenticity of these broadcasts, and the sort of rough and ready shape that they have remains appealing for that reason.
I think that's well put, both of you, and another great point and question for Obed. And I know we talk about co-option all the time. And in fact, if past is prologue, we already know that this is already afoot. This has long been happening before, as podcasts have become more popular. We go back and we look into legacy media attacking radio as a new medium. That's when that whole War of the Worlds alleged hoax broadcast debacle happened, and late 1930s when we pretend that there was mass hysteria sparked by this broadcast. And interestingly, the history of that's mostly mythological. The groups that were attacking that show as, quote, fake news of the day were the very establishment and legacy print media that were fearful of radio as a platform for authenticity. for diversity, for different voices that challenge their power structure. We saw the same thing with television in the 60s, as the FCC's Newton Minow referred to TV as a vast wasteland because he saw it getting wildly co-opted already by the 1960s. And I say about your book that it was cautious but optimistic, that you expertly point out this is happening as you all are writing this book, as you were doing your own podcast. You're watching this happen. You're watching the space close around this. And this is exactly why legacy media attacked Joe Rogan and Spotify. Because, and again, this is an endorsement of Joe Rogan. And by the way, as a musician, I can't say enough bad things about Spotify, but that's another discussion. But the issue isn't necessarily Rogan. It's that he's garnering some 11 million average viewers and listeners, where on even the most popular of the cable shows on Fox, Tucker Carlson, gets a mere fraction of that. In fact, if you lump up the major talk shows and news programs combined in the legacy establishment press, they begin to approach the number of a Joe Rogan. So I see that issue as part of the same historical pattern of losing control of the narrative, fear of losing control of the narrative. And by the way, by painting with a broad brush that podcasting is dangerous, it's misinformation. And one of the fears I have is once you can start tarring and feathering, so to speak, this group, or they're trying to address the entire medium, is that it may make people less curious about the very important ones that you all talk about in your book. So I was wondering if you might address some of those concerns, or maybe where you see us heading, or how best we can navigate some of those challenges.
Yeah, I think Nick and I have talked about looking into part of this more, what you just said there, Mickey. But I think it's important for podcasters to consider that we don't profile Joe Rogan in our book. We don't find him to be a decolonial podcaster. But if you are someone who's in this decolonial space that we talk about, what's happening to Rogan should be very important to you, because if the tools prove effective against him with an audience of his size, and he already has tons of privilege and celebrity status, those tools will definitely work against you. And so being cognizant of that fact that, some of these small like podcasts, and I mean small in terms of comparison to Rogan, like Guilty Feminist or Gender Not or something like that. If someone just a passerby in legacy media calls them fake news, which I'm not, but let's say somebody does, I would wager a lot of the audience would just take that as truth and never look at that podcast. I mean, that's a lot of power we're talking about there. So I would encourage audiences to dig deeper. Don't just trust when someone says something is false. Really investigate whether or not it's false, and know the context in which the claim is being made. Like Mickey pointed out rightly, when I hear attacks on Joe Rogan, I don't get in the weeds about ivermectin or vaccines or doctors. I see it as an attack of one aging form of media on new media. And that's how the context in which I view it. And I'm less worried about the kind of actual content they're supposedly debating.
Nick, anything you want to add?
Yeah, thank you, Nolan. I agree with all of that. I would say too that as somebody who spends a lot of time studying popular culture, I'm not posing an answer here, but I'm more so posing a question. I often wonder if from a popular cultural standpoint, or the standpoint of that type of analysis, whether a legacy media takeover of the podcasting space means that we reach a space where podcasting just isn't cool. And when something just isn't cool anymore, the tendency with resistant cultures that we build within popular culture, whatever those resistant cultures may be in terms of fashion or dance or other things we do, which are media related and certainly central to media, whether there's another form that develops after podcasting, where these voices migrate to, that is in fact more cool. And I would point to things like, for example, the notion that the corporate takeover of Facebook, at least for my students, has rendered Facebook uncool. It's a geriatric piece. at this point. And some of that is certainly related to the corporate nature of it, the fact that white supremacists have flooded Facebook. It doesn't help that when students fly to something like Instagram, that it's also owned by these larger conglomerates. But what I am interested in is that the continued migration as soon out of these formats, as soon as they become less and less cool. Again, it is problematic. Even going to something like TikTok, where you go, oh my goodness, okay, now that's just as problematic as anything else. But I do notice young people continuing to move when things, when I guess we could say when corporations essentially kill the vitality of those things. And I do worry about that. Will it, if something happens to Rogan, does that signal the death of the vitality of podcasting as a format, generally speaking? And do people find other ways to do it? Is there another way of doing podcasting? I mean, there are a lot of questions like that that we didn't answer in this book, but I think we are going to have to be thinking about within the next 5 to 10 years.
Absolutely. And Kim says in the comments, noticing live streams like Twitch and podcasts, says these are new outlets of information. I mean, in the new Project Censored book, we have a whole section interrogating TikTok and calling out some of the problems with it. But we're also simultaneously, we're addressing it because it is significant. It is a place that people are getting news and information, whether we like it or not. And so rather than dismissing it, I think it's important that we interrogate, monitor, look at, get involved with, right? And maybe even try to shape the nature of how it goes. But as you both eloquently pointed out and did in the book, kind of like when things go corporate, cool moves on, migrate, right? Like Facebook is so-called boomer land, right? But yet again, the promises of it years ago were real. Those are very real. And I think that those things in society are always very real. And so that's why we don't want to paint too broadly with the brush and say, well, the technology is the problem. It's not, it's who's controlling it, who has access to it, right? And you all point that out really well in the book. And you certainly do from the perspective of decolonizing that space. I'd like to thank both of you for taking time to be here with us in the Journalism Speaker Series here today, both Dr. Nolan Higdon, Dr. Nicholas Baham III. Anything here anybody else wants to say, or either of you gentlemen have anything else you'd like to add? Anywhere people can follow your work, learn more about what you're doing, you can say that now, put it in the chat if you like. I see Nolan's typing. Typing. There you go. Nolan on Twitter at Nolan_Higdon. Nick, you want to put anything in here?
Yeah, I think I'm not using it hasn't gotten, it's no longer cool for me either. So yeah. I think that I've got for my Twitter, it's at Dr. Dreadlocks, I think.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been on.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure to do this, Mickey, although I confess that as soon as the session is over, I'm gonna have to clear my mind of images of Candace Owens and Sean Hannity swinging.
Yeah.
Well, I'll need a little time on that.
a little decompression. Yeah. Well, I won't take responsibility for putting them there in your mind. But gentlemen, it's been a real pleasure, Nick and Nolan. It's again, it's an honor to have you here. I think this is a stellar book. The only thing I have to say about academic publishers is they sure know how to take important things and make them less accessible, right? Because the price of academic textbooks is challenging. But you can get exam copies, and if people are interested, I would strongly urge you to contact Nick or Nolan, or if you want to get in touch with them through me, feel free, mhuff@dvc.edu. I would definitely like to encourage you all to get involved in journalism. It does matter as our second priority, even if you have other things that you're interested in first. And one of the things that we slightly touched on here, kind of the deplatforming of that space and the control and co-option of digital media. We're going to have a talk next month by Lee Camp formerly of RT America. That whole channel was disappeared. We may hear from Abby Martin. Her whole channel was disappeared from YouTube. YouTube is on a mad purge right now, curating that space for alleged misinformation. And I think we need to be very mindful of what's going to happen to some podcasts and what's going to happen to some really important voices, some of which are already hard to find that may be disappeared. So we certainly need to be on our toes. And I think Nick and Nolan's book, The Podcaster's Dilemma, Decolonizing Podcasters in the Era of Surveillance Capitalism, does give us the critical media literacy tools to understand not just this newer space, but the media landscape and ecosystem in general, and why it's important that we all get involved and we really support marginalized voices getting much more platformed, not deplatformed in these spaces. So with that, I want to thank everybody for taking time and being here with us today. Again, you can contact me, mhuff@dvc.edu. More than happy to be in touch with you all and encourage you to sign up for our courses. We did just have Too Late Start Journalism 110 Media Society course to start with Professor Michael Levitin, so you can still sign up for those, believe it or not, just started on Monday. Anyway, thank you all so much for being here. Nick and Nolan, thanks as ever for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
We'll see all of you next time. Thanks for joining.
Newsletter today.
Thanks, guys.